Thank you so much for joining us for our fireside chat. We are thrilled to have our guest speaker today, Miss Stephanie Deutsch, with us to discuss her life as a writer, as well as the phenomenal book that she wrote that we will definitely be getting into. So just a little information about Stephanie, if you don't mind. I'm going to dabble into your bio. So Stephanie was born in Washington, D.C. Yes, she is a native, everyone. We have a unicorn in our mix.
I'm a native, and my husband's a native, and all my children are natives.
So. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I'm like shocked at how rare that is these days. Her father was in the U.S. Foreign Service, and she grew up in 3 different places: Arlington, Virginia, Lower Hutt, New Zealand, and Paris, France. She studied Russian language in college and Soviet Union area studies in grad school. But as she turned to writing after raising 3 children on Capitol Hill, she realized her real interest was in American history and in biography. So this is exactly why we're here during Black History Month to discuss this. I'm like super excited. She spent 5 years doing the research that went into her book, You Need a Schoolhouse: Booker T. Washington, Julius Rosenwald, and the Building of Schools for the Segregated South, which was published in 2011 by the Northwestern University Press. Since then, she's visited many Rosenwald schools and met scores of alumni. So Stephanie, I would love to just dive right in and get to know a little bit more about you. So what career did you dream about pursuing when you were a kid?
That's an interesting question. And I saw it on your list and I sort of pondered over it. One of the interesting things that happened to me as a child was that when I was 10, for Christmas, I received a diary, a small diary with just a couple of lines for every day of the year. Mm-hmm. And I started writing in that diary every single day. And looking back on it, I think that I always had a sense of myself as a writer. Mm-hmm. Here I was writing something every day that I didn't have to write. And sometimes it was silly things like had a fight with my sister, or, mommy was mean, or, something like that. But sometimes I would actually try to describe something, or I would use interesting words. And my mother actually was a journalist and a writer. So I think I sort of had in my mind that a writer was something you could be, though I didn't have any idea how you'd go about it. But I think it was an idea that was there somewhere.
Wonderful. And so we learned earlier, just a few minutes ago, that you studied Russian language in college. How did you come to that major, and what made you decide to want to pursue that?
My father, as you had mentioned, was in the Foreign Service. So he was kind of interested in careers that had to do with government and foreign travel. And he said to me, well, you're good at languages. Maybe you should study Russian, because this was the Cold War. And whereas now, if you were interested in international relations, you might study Chinese or Arabic, might be the languages you'd choose. Back in the 60s, the language you'd choose would be Russian. And I also like literature a lot, and Russian literature is great. So I studied Russian in college, and it's hard, it's hard to learn a foreign language. It's hard to learn a foreign language that has a different alphabet, which Russian does. But I learned it, and I got a scholarship to go to a summer program at the University of Michigan that included a trip to the Soviet Union. So back then in the 60s, it wasn't Russia, it was the Soviet Union, the USSR. So I had a 3-week trip there with a group of other students, which was really fascinating. And so we were speaking Russian, and that was thrilling. And when I graduated from college, I got a job. I moved to Moscow, and I had a job as a babysitter for an American embassy family. Wow. So I was living in Russia. I was living with an American family, but I had the chance to speak Russian and to travel. And it was really interesting. And so when I came back, I decided I would go to graduate school. Mm-hmm. And so I went for 2 years and got a master's in Soviet Union studies. But life is strange. You don't always end up doing what you set out to do. And by the time I got my master's degree, I had decided that this was very hard. The politics of it were complicated and intense. And I just decided that wasn't what I was going to do.
Mhm.
So I did an unusual thing in a way. And again, it was something that I was able to do because I had the financial resources to do it, frankly. I stayed home with my kids. I had 3 children and a stepchild. So I had a big family and I took care of them. And while they were growing up, I was sort of thinking about what comes next. And I started writing freelance writing, like you don't have a job as a writer, but you write. We have a neighborhood newspaper on Capitol Hill that I still write for, actually. And I started submitting articles to them. And I think I told you that my mother was a journalist, and one of her former colleagues invited me to write book reviews. And so I was nervous about it because I had never written a book review for publication, but I started doing that, and I got more and more confident. And one by one, my children went to college, so I had a little more time to myself. And by the time my youngest child went to college, I was pretty much working on writing pretty seriously. And then at some point, my husband's cousin suggested to me Julius Rosenwald. Mm-hmm. We haven't mentioned the fact that my husband is a great grandson of this man, Julius Rosenwald. Mm-hmm. And I had heard of him, but I knew he was my husband's great grandfather, but I didn't really know anything about him. So my husband's cousin, Betsy, says to me, well, what people in the family called him JR? She said, well, what about JR? And I said, well, I don't know, JR, businessman. Okay, I'll do a little research. So when I did a little research, I discovered there were lots of interesting things about JR, but the thing that captivated me was he was friends with Booker T. Washington, and they put together a plan to build schools. One of the reasons I was hooked was I felt kind of guilty about the fact that I certainly recognized the name Booker T. Washington, but I realized I didn't really know very much about him. Mm-hmm. I would say Booker T. Washington has one of the most recognizable names. I mean, everyone has heard the name, right? But who was he? What did he actually do? I didn't know.
Right.
And so when I started that research, when I read this book, mm-hmm. Then I was really hooked, because this was a whole area of history that I was shockingly, and we're in Black History Month, and we can talk about how shocking it is that there's big pieces of history that a lot of us don't know. So that was really the impetus for my book. And I was lucky that I'm doing my research just at the time that there's an organization called the National Trust for Historic Preservation that works to preserve historic buildings. So just as I'm starting my research, they chose Rosenwald schools as the most endangered historic sites in America.
Wow.
Because at one time, there had been almost 5,000. When segregation ended, that was the beginning of the end for Rosenwald schools, because they were Black schools. And so they closed. And so a lot of them were way out in the country, and they just got boarded up, and people kind of forgot about them, or some of them fell apart, burned down. But some of them were preserved and are now being preserved as people increasingly recognize what an important piece of history they represent.
Yeah. It's interesting because when I was reading your book, I think you and I had this discussion about how little I knew about Booker T. Washington as well. Like I always equated him to Tuskegee, great, congratulations, great school, right? But didn't know much about him. So I think what was really fascinating to me was I grew up knowing Black history because my grandmother was adamant about making sure all of us knew our history, right? So I was admiring your bookshelf behind you because like that's what I grew up with. I grew up with books. So for me, reading and knowledge was always really important. But the most profound thing, like my grandmother made me watch the PBS special Eyes on the Prize.
Did she?
Every single year. But that knowledge and information is so important because there's always so much to learn, and there's so many nuances in Black history that, are just so incredibly rich and important, right? Like, I never heard of Rosenwald schools before I read this book, right? So like, to know that there was this passion for education and these buildings that were erected was just like mind blowing to me. Like, how did I never ever hear this name before, right? So again, it's wonderful to me that it doesn't matter, sort of what the source is or whatever, like you can always find and learn more. And it's just fascinating to like know that there's all this history and knowledge, and like it's so important. So I just want to say thank you personally for writing this book and teaching us this, because I think it was just so fascinating to read.
I should give a shout out to your grandmother, because she did what, now that I'm a grandmother, what we grandmothers need to do, which is, help our kids see the stuff that they need to know.
Yeah.
And I always say when I talk to people, if you have a grandmother, talk to her, find out about her life. Mm-hmm. Why was your grandmother so committed to teaching you Black history? What had her experience been? There are fascinating stories, and your grandparents grow up in a different generation from you. And they have things that once they're gone, once your grandparents are gone, you'll never find out those stories.
Yeah.
And so I always encourage people to talk to their grandparents as much as they can.
So what's interesting, Stephanie, and this is my grandmother passed away in 2012, and she was the love of my life. I actually have a picture of her right above my head.
Oh.
But my grandfather was the first Black mayor of a city called DeWarty in Southern California, which is where my family mostly grew up, right? And so it was a huge deal. My grandmother actually, so my grandparents were the first Black homeowners in the San Gabriel Valley, like ever. And my grandmother bought that house without the realtor ever seeing her and knowing who she was until they went to go purchase, like sign the paperwork for the house, because they knew the neighborhood that they were trying to buy the house in, they would never sell it to a Black family. So in order to see the house, she said, oh, my husband, has to work. Like, can you just leave the key and we'll go, that night to look at it. So the realtor wasn't there when they went to look at the house, right? And so it's just like those types of stories and those nuances. And my grandmother was also a writer. I'm a writer, so it's just like, kind of having those historical moments. So I have some of her papers and her journals and all of that. It's so important. And just that those stories, that information is just, I can't imagine, like, because I grew up in that neighborhood and I used to just play with all the little, the white girls down the street and the Latino boys down the street. We were all just, kids playing. But to know that a few years previously, my family wouldn't even been welcome in that neighborhood. Like, my mom was the first Black student to ever attend the elementary school that I later attended. You know what I mean? So it's just like, she officially like integrated the school, so it's just like.
When was that? What year was it that your mom?
So they moved into, I want to say they moved into the house when my mom was about 5 or 6 years old. So like 1966, 65.
Okay. So just as the schools were desegregating, and yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So Stephanie, I mean, to kind of continue this conversation, Black history is not really taught in depth, right? We talked about that in public school. So what would you say would be some of the first steps, talking to grandparents, doing that research, but what would be some of the steps that we could take to really make sure our students, all students, right, are learning this history and this rich information about this culture?
Well, in different places, there are different opportunities. One of the things I love about the fact that Rosenwald schools are being restored is that visiting a Rosenwald school, going to a place where something happened, is a really powerful way to start to think about a story. And I will tell you about a Rosenwald school I visited that literally, it had me in tears. It's a very small school in a town called Sadieville, Kentucky. Very small town, small school, small town. And the day I went, it was snowing. It was really cold and it was snowing. And the mayor of the town was the person who took us to see the school because it was locked up most of the time. And he unlocked the school and we went in and it was freezing cold. And it's beautiful. It's not all gussied up. The school wasn't all fancied up. It looked sort of as if the kids had just left yesterday. And I was just overwhelmed with this feeling of when the kids came to this school on a day like this, it was really cold. And, then they had the pot-bellied stove in the corner and they'd gather. One of the things I'd heard from Rosenwald students is they'd gather the sticks to put in the pot-bellied stove to keep it going and to warm the school up. And I just felt like I was one of those kids. I was so cold. And yet the classroom offered this sense of kind of welcome. And this was where you could come, and there was a teacher, and there was an opportunity for you to learn. So I think field trips, I just love the idea of field trips, going to visit a place. I also think what you said earlier about experience, if you have Black parents or grandparents, talk to them. If you have friends whose experience is different from yours, try to talk to them.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Talking to people. I think we should have more like roundtables and just capture this information. I actually had the opportunity a long time ago to meet Maya Angelou. And I know.
She went to a Rosenwald school. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Oh my gosh, Brandelyn, in I Know Why the Caged Bird Sing, she has a beautiful chapter about her graduation from her Rosenwald school.
I didn't even put that together. I read that book a million times. But I think to your point, like there's beautiful ways to share stories, like even reading my grandmother's journals, which are so personal, you know what I mean? It's just like, I learned so much about her, just who she was, that I wouldn't have known otherwise, you know what I mean? So I think it's really important to share those stories, to be transparent, to have those conversations. So I think in thinking about your book, if you could we talked about Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington coming together to open these schools. We're going to give some copies of the book to our students so that way they can read the full story. But we talked a lot about not knowing much about Booker T. Washington, right? Because I remember when you and I spoke and I was just like, I had no idea. I had all of my little notes.
Yeah.
What would you say is some of the interesting things that you've learned about Booker T. Washington in your research that most people wouldn't know?
There were a couple of stories about Booker T. Washington's childhood that moved me very much. One of them is a well-known story. When he was enslaved up to the age of 9, he had to work. Mm-hmm. And one of the jobs he had was the daughter of the family that enslaved him was a teacher at a nearby school. And so every morning she would ride a horse to the school. And Booker's job was to sit on the back of the horse with her and go to the school so he could bring the horse back to work in the fields during the day. The horse was needed. So he wrote in Up From Slavery about how they'd get to the school and he'd climb down off the horse and go up to the school building and tiptoe in the window and look in the window. And he said what he saw inside looked to him like paradise. Mm. He said, desks and books and maps and pictures on the wall and a teacher there helping them learn. To him, an enslaved child for whom that's forbidden, that looked like paradise. Mm-hmm. And that was a story that I loved because it was really vivid. The other story from his childhood as a slave that really, I mean, this is like a detail. He said, we used to wear flax shirts. And I don't know exactly what the flax is, but it's a shirt that's made out of some kind of plant material, but it's very, very rough on the inside. And he said it was torture. He said when you would put on this, it was like sackcloth, I guess. You always hear about sackcloth. Mm-hmm. He said his older brother offered to wear the shirt several times for him to get it broken in so it wouldn't be so rough. And wow. I mean, I'm getting tears in my eyes thinking about it, actually. That was something he remembered that his brother had done for him. Mm-hmm. And that the clothing was so rough and uncomfortable. That kind of detail, I think, is interesting. You might not remember the date that happened, but that's a story you'll remember. You can imagine yourself wearing clothes so uncomfortable that it made you cry, and mm-hmm. that your sibling offered to wear it for you so it wouldn't be so rough. Really,
and what stands out to me the most about that is like one of the main intentions of slavery was to break up families, right? Mm-hmm. And sort of separate. But when you hear these moments of your brother, looking out for you.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I love that. I love that. So, at FLOC, we strive to make education more accessible for all of our students. How important would you say education access was to Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald? And, what were some of the challenges that they faced when they were opening their schools in the South?
Well, that's a huge question. I'll start with the two of them.
Mhm.
Julius Rosenwald actually never completed high school. Julius Rosenwald's parents were Jewish immigrants from Germany. And Julius was born in Springfield, Illinois, and his parents ran a clothing store, which was a classic thing that a lot of immigrants did. And so he worked at the store on weekends.
Mhm.
And when he was 16, his parents sent him to New York to live with his uncles who lived there and learn other parts of the clothing business.
Mhm.
So in other words, he did not complete high school because what was seen as important for him, what his parents really wanted for him, was to be good in business and to be able to support himself. And of course, they had no idea he'd become extremely wealthy. They just wanted him to succeed in business. But he actually never had the opportunity, certainly never went to college. And never graduated from high school. He was, however, I think we often talk about, we want to turn our students into lifelong learners. I think of myself as a lifelong learner because I'm still learning so much. Julius Rosenwald was very much of a lifelong learner. And that was one of the things that made him so open to Booker T. Washington when he finally met him. Now, Washington faced, of course, much greater hurdles because he was a slave and education was forbidden to slaves. I mean, you were not, if you had slaves, it was against the law to teach them to read. So the challenges were great, but both men, largely through their own efforts, did become educated. And one of the things Washington talks about in Up From Slavery is how at one point after emancipation, he was working in a coal mine and he heard these two men talking in the dark of the coal mine. And they were talking about a school called Hampton. Mm-hmm. And he perked up his ears because they said, it's for Black people and you don't have to pay to go there. And so he thought, that's what I want. And Hampton had been founded by the Freedmen's Bureau right after emancipation to educate teachers to go out because there was this huge mass of African-American people that had never had the chance to be educated. And so Hampton was, and is now, of course, one of the most preeminent historically Black colleges. And Booker T. Washington did manage to go to Hampton. In both cases, you would say they found a way out of no way. They moved forward, they kept moving forward. And the no way was harsher for sure for Washington, but there were still things that Julius had to overcome. And one of the things that I think is most interesting about Julius is, so his parents had left Europe because of anti-Semitism there. Mm-hmm. In 1908, there was a big race riot in Springfield, Illinois, the town that Julius came from. Mm-hmm. He wasn't there at the time. He had already moved to Chicago, but this caught his interest. And it made him think of things that were happening in Europe, where there were these riots called pogroms, where mobs would go through the Jewish part of town and they would break the windows of Jewish stores and they would set fires. And a lot of Jews in this country were raising money and sending it to Jews in Europe to help them deal with this situation. And Julius Rosenwald kind of made a connection in his mind, like, gosh, we're sending money to Jews in Europe, but here we've got people doing almost the same thing to Black people in this country. Mm-hmm. And he made that connection and he said, we can't have a country where one part of the population is consistently mistreating and holding down another part. We can only thrive if we all thrive. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a very crucial, important realization for him, making the connection he was a child of Jews who had fled to get away from exactly the things that were happening to Black people here.
What would you think Booker T. Washington would think about our education system today?
Well, he definitely was a huge believer in education. And so he would be glad that education is, that, you know, public education is available now. And it's not always the best. Not every parent thinks that the public education accessible to their child is the best, but it is accessible to every child. And I think that would be a something that he would find very gratifying, because that was the whole purpose of his life, was education.
Right.
And he felt that education was the absolute necessary first step towards real equality. And you know, he was criticized a lot by other African-American leaders who felt that he should have insisted more on things like voting rights and anti-lynching legislation and stuff like that, which were things he did support and did put some effort toward, but he was very single focused. He felt education. None of this will matter if we can't get education. None of it will matter if we have a great mass of uneducated people.
I think, you know, to your point about education being the focal point, like that's why FLOC is here still all this time, you know, because one of the things that, you know, makes us different as an organization is that our tutoring program focuses on intervention. So we don't want to just push kids along. We want to make sure you really understand so that you can naturally move along and move forward because you get it, right? And so to me, education has always been important. You know, I'm a first generation college graduate, and I'm in a program at Howard University right now, like that forever learning we talked about, right? Just because there is always so much information that's out there, but having access to the right tools is the most important piece, right? And so, you know, one of the things that we love the most at FLOC is giving our kids experiences, giving them access to people like you who can tell stories, who can talk to them about how to think about a career, how, you know, shifts and changes in life can ultimately lead you to where you're supposed to go. So it's really exciting to think about. I think if Booker T. Washington was still here, he'd be on the board at FLOC, like he'd be a huge supporter.
He and Julius Rosenwald both would.
Absolutely.
You know,
Exactly.
Julius Rosenwald would be giving major grants to help support FLOC, and they'd both be on the board.
Take them as well. So, so Stephanie, as you know, we have 6 students who recently published a book. They wrote a book over the summer last year, and now they are published, and we're planning all these wonderful activities for them, you know, what we can do with COVID and all that. What advice would you have for them as they're, you know, beginning their writing careers and, you know, thinking future forward? Like one of the students actually approached me and wants to write another book. Like he has another book.
Really?
So yeah, so I'm like really excited about that. But what advice would you have for them as they start working on their writing career?
That is such an interesting question. One piece of advice I have, and it seems so obvious, but I think the most important thing in writing is the meaning. In other words, a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on style. And in fact, it's funny, when my son, who's now over 40, but when my son was in high school, he wrote something and I said to him, you know, I feel like you use a lot of big fancy words that you don't really need to use. And he said, I know, Mom, but I love to do that. You know, he loved to show off the fancy words he knew. I think when you're writing, the most important thing is, what are you trying to say? And how can you communicate it most directly to your audience? And if your audience is going to be impressed by big fancy words, okay, by all means, use them. But your main, as a writer, the main thing you're trying to do is have something to say that you think is worthwhile, and then say it in a way that people can understand. Make it easy for them to understand. And Brandelyn, it's something I was extremely conscious of when I was writing my book. A lot of history is written with so much detail that you feel like you're drowning before you want to get the story, but there's a lot of detail and you forget the dates and you kind of can't remember who's who. And so if you're writing history, one of the things I found was I tried to break it down into manageable bits so that by the time Booker T. Washington is famous, you have a sense of who he was and what the world he was dealing with was, what the problems he was confronting were. By the time Julius Rosenwald makes a fortune with Sears, you have a sense of where he was coming from, what the world, you know, what he had to deal with. I think it's really important not to sort of take on too much. You know, it's much better to take a smaller subject and deal with that. And then maybe later you'll take on the bigger subject, but you got to start with the smaller stories before you can tackle the bigger stories. I guess that's one thing I feel very much. And for the people who want to write fiction, that is something that I haven't really done, except that I wrote some little picture books for my baby sister when I was a child. Stories are compelling, as we talked about a little bit, Brandelyn. Stories are compelling and people love stories. So if it's stories that captivate you, that is a very worthwhile thing. People love stories. And if you feel so inclined, a story that has some kind of message, a story that tells some kind of slightly larger truth, those are powerful. Those are very, very powerful. And we probably all remember stories we've read that just captivated us or that we believed in. As I told you, my story that captivated me was about this Russian ballet dancer who danced all over the world. Even though I was not a dancer, it had nothing to do, but I just found that story captivating. But a lot of people, the stories that captivate them are, you know, Harry Potter. Harry Potter is a great story. It's not true, but it has truths in it. It has truths in it, right? You can't really play Quidditch up in the sky with
the flying broom and all that.
No, but Harry is a believable character and he's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to figure out what the right thing is and do it. Well, that's one of the basic stories of all humankind, right?
Yeah.
Figuring out the right thing and doing it. That's the story of our lives.
I love it. Oh, Stephanie, this has been so amazing. I could literally sit here and talk to you, as you know, for hours.
We could. We know that we could. We have and we will.
Did you have any last bits of advice or any last nuggets that you'd like to leave our students with before we close out today?
Oh, that's a sweet offer. Well, I guess the main thing is don't be discouraged. When you're a writer, I used to have a whole file that I kept of all the rejection letters I'd gotten. Because like I told you, I wrote the book about Pocahontas. And I sent it off to agents and they said, no, I don't think so. No, this is not for us. No, the publishing house. No, we're not interested. I had one letter that I said was my favorite rejection. It was like a form letter. It was printed. It said, thank you very much. We're not interested in your work. And then a person had written on the top, sorry. So, I mean, I think if I have any advice, it's that, yeah, you might get in writing and in other things you try in life, you might fail. You know, there probably will be times where what you think you're going to do doesn't work out. A project that you think is just perfect, it doesn't catch on. Not every good idea finds realization. And it's important to keep going. And it's important to sort of, to not be too discouraged when that happens. And to not feel, oh, I got rejected. This means I'm a terrible writer. Well, you might be a terrible writer, but you could become a better writer.
Keep writing.
Keep writing.
Yep.
And I guess that's what I would say. Don't get discouraged.
I love that. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been fascinating. And as I mentioned, we have a few lucky students who'll be receiving a signed copy of your book. And so we're super excited to share that with
so
them.
glad.
And we will definitely have you back, because I'm sure once our students get their hands on the book, they will have lots of questions, and we'd love to have you come back and talk with us, and we'll do it hopefully in person at some point.
I would love that. I would love that. That'd be great.
Thank you all so much for joining us this evening on our Black History Month edition of Fireside Chat. And we will see you next month with our new topic and our new speaker.